The Monkey's Paw by W. W. Jacobs. Once upon a time, in a small, cozy house on the outskirts of a quaint village, lived Mr. and Mrs. White with their son, Herbert. Their lives were simple and content, filled with warmth and the everyday joys of family life. One stormy evening, their friend, Sergeant Major Morris, paid them a visit. Morris had traveled to many distant lands and had fascinating stories to tell. This time, he brought with him something quite extraordinary, a shriveled old monkey's paw. Mr. White, intrigued by the strange object, asked, "What is that?" "It's a magical charm," replied Morris, his voice tinged with a hint of dread. "It can grant 3 wishes to 3 different people. But be cautious, for magic often comes with unforeseen consequences." Herbert and Mrs. White listened, initially dismissing the tale as mere superstition. But Morris's somber tone and the gravity in his eyes piqued Mr. White's curiosity. "You really believe this thing can grant wishes?" asked Mr. White. "It has already done so," Morris answered, his face growing pale. "The first man who owned it had 3 wishes. Yes, he got what he asked for, but he paid dearly for it." With a mix of fascination and skepticism, Mr. White took the monkey's paw from Morris. Despite Morris's warnings, he felt compelled to try it. That night, after Morris had left and the family had gone to bed, Mr. White sat alone by the fire, the monkey's paw in his hand. He thought about what to wish for, and then, almost without realizing, he whispered, "I wish for 200 pounds. The paw twisted in his hand, but nothing else happened. He laughed at himself for believing in such nonsense and went to bed. The next morning, the Whites went about their daily routines. Herbert went to work at the local factory. As the day wore on, a man from the factory arrived at the Whites' home, looking grim. "I'm sorry to bring bad news," he said, nervously twisting his hat in his hands. "There was an accident at the factory. Your son, Herbert, tried to help, but he was caught in the machinery." Mrs. White screamed, and Mr. White stood stunned, clutching the back of a chair for support. The man handed them an envelope. "The company wishes to offer you this compensation." Inside the envelope were 200 pounds. Days turned into weeks, and the Whites were engulfed in sorrow. One night, Mrs. White had a desperate idea. "The paw!" she cried. "We still have 2 wishes left. Wish for Herbert to come back." Mr. White was horrified. "No," he said. "It's dangerous. We don't know what might happen." But Mrs. White was insistent. Consumed by her grief, she begged and pleaded until Mr. White, unable to bear her suffering, finally gave in. With a heavy heart, he took the paw and wished for Herbert to return. They waited in silence. The minutes dragged on until a knock at the door shattered the quiet. Mrs. White rushed to open it, but Mr. White held her back. "What if it's not really Herbert?" he whispered, terror seizing his heart. The knocking grew louder and more insistent. Panicking, Mr. White grabbed the paw once more. "I wish for everything to be as it was before," he cried desperately. The knocking ceased. When they opened the door, no one was there. The night was still and quiet once more. The Whites hugged each other, their relief mingled with profound sorrow. They had learned a harrowing lesson about the perils of tampering with fate. From that night on, they chose to live their lives without seeking magical shortcuts, finding solace in their memories and each other. The monkey's paw was never seen again. The story teaches us that interfering with fate can lead to unexpected and often tragic consequences. True happiness comes from appreciating what we have, not from trying to force our destiny to change. The end.